Welcome back, everyone, to Neighbors in the Network. I'm James Pinedo, your host. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, John Hendrickson, the Policy Director at Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, James. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation.
We were talking about how Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation it always strikes me whenever I see a new policy brief or some other report that comes out, how thoughtful and thorough they are. And Gabriel Green, who nominated you
Yeah.
for this interview, mentioned to me that you're both a character and really sharp. So I'm really excited to hear how this path formed for you. So perhaps it's a way of starting out. Can you tell me how was it? How did you grow up? How did that shape you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you to Gabriel as well for suggesting me to be a guest. But I grew up in northern Minnesota, and I was born and raised there, and I went to college in North Dakota. It was sort of a family tradition to go to the University of North Dakota, so I went there, and I never thought I would go into the public policy field. I originally wanted to be a history teacher, so I was a history major and went to graduate school. And when I graduated, there just at that time there was not a lot of jobs, and so I decided to do an internship in Washington D.C. for the Heritage Foundation. And the reason I wanted to pick Heritage was that they had a special division within their think tank that specialized in American political thought and specifically the history of the American conservative movement. So I worked with a couple of their scholars there. And then when I finished that internship, I was able to get a job. I wanted to come back to the Midwest, and there was an opening at a think tank here in Iowa, and that was 2006. And so I started working at a think tank in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, in 2006, and it was kind of a neat job because I got the blessings of both worlds. I started in public policy, but our founder also had us on a college campus, and so for 10 years I was able to teach history on that campus. And so I taught courses mainly in American history, but also Western civilization. And then in 2016, I was transferred over to Iowans for Tax Relief and moved up to Des Moines area. Our office moved up to the Des Moines area to be closer to the capital. And so that's sort of how I got started in public policy. I was trained as a historian, but now I'm doing policy work, so I don't know if that's good or bad.
In my book, that's amazing and makes you quite a fascinating person to speak to. So tell me though, what was it about history, like as a child and in college, that first caught your attention?
Yeah, well, my mom really got me interested in history because she encouraged me to read. And so in grade school, in fact, I still have the book. She bought me a children's biography of Abraham Lincoln, and I just fell in love with Abraham Lincoln, and I developed a deep interest in the American Civil War. And so I spent most of my childhood studying the Civil War and just reading everything I could on it. And I wanted to, and my career goal was wanted to teach history. And so that's how I decided to go into that field. But at that time, it just, when I graduated, there just wasn't, I went on a lot of interviews, but just not a lot of job openings.
Sure.
I do think it fits well with public policy because I think we can learn a lot from our past, especially in looking at what how things worked and applying historical examples to problems to today. One thing I think I have a unique aspect to my work is I'm not, and some might think this to be a cardinal sin, but I don't do numbers, and so I tend to look at things from a philosophical, historical point of view, and I know a lot of times public policy is heavy on data and Excel, and that's all important. But I also think that it's good to take a look at uh, public policy problems from a historical perspective as well as a philosophical perspective, because we need we need the data to look at issues and to explain our solutions, but we also need a sort of a philosophical basis for a foundation of what we believe in as a movement. And our ideas have to be rooted, I think, in certain key principles. And I believe, strongly in one thing that we need to do, not just at the state level, but at the national level, is kind of rediscover those principles of the American founding that we've drifted away from.
Yeah.
For example, federalism, and SPN has done a lot of work in trying to, revive federalism, and that's just one example.
Yeah, I'm always excited by the new initiatives or the advancements in the old initiatives that SPN has had to do, like I'm thinking about American Habits or Center for Practical Federalism, but all of the network really does amazing work when it
Yes.
comes to federalism. Tell me though, when you say you look at it from a historical background or a philosophical background, I can see someone saying, well, that's just an attempt at moralizing, which you shouldn't be moralizing through your public policy. What do you make of that sort of argument?
Well, I would respond that I think you need first of all, I would call it a foundation for public policy. And so, for example, one of the big issues we're working on here in Iowa is tax reform. And so when I'm writing on tax reform, I can look at both examples from state history, not just here in Iowa, but other states, but also looking at examples nationally in our national history of past uh, tax reforms that have proven successful. And so I think the data is always good. We need data to look at things, and to we can argue about from a data point of view of flat tax is beneficial to all income tax payers versus a progressive tax system. But I think that philosophical foundation can point us in the direction where we need to go. And so, for example, with the American founding and federalism, federalism is more than just dollars and cents. It's also as one scholar put it, it's woven into the fabric of our Constitution. And so, for example, when we think of we're approaching a presidential election year, and when we think of the Electoral College, which is those on the left would like to get rid of the Electoral College, which I think would be a major mistake. But the Electoral College is also a product of federalism, and it's not just federal money going to the states. Federalism goes a lot deeper within that, and so I think that's where history can kind of help further our arguments on why we need things like the Electoral College or why federalism is important. And the other thing I'd just point out quick is I reference a lot of my writings of the 1920s because I really believe strongly in that period as an example of how we can solve problems today, especially on a national level. So I have great admiration for President Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge and even Herbert Hoover. I probably would be excommunicated by saying Herbert Hoover in the free market movement, but I think I think we can learn a lot from those guys. I mean, when we look at issues of taxes and spending, looking at issues of immigration and trade policy, there's a lot of wisdom that we can learn. Warren Harding famously said, "It's good to drink from the fountains of the American founders," and I think we need to do that again. And sort of applying history to some of these public policy issues is one way to do that.
Yeah. Well, when you speak, I think the word that really stood out to me is foundation, foundational. And it strikes me that in today, at least with all of the interviews that I've done to date on this podcast, Neighbors in the Network, I have been struck by people often find that the lack of community is a source of a lot of the issues that we have in our states.
Yeah,
It's hard to build a community, at least it strikes me. It's hard to build a community around data points.
it
But
is.
if you have a foundation, a philosophical foundation, which aligns, that you
Mhm.
find some sort of core ground, all of a sudden you have the building blocks for community.
Yes. And I would say that's a key point that you mentioned, James, because oftentimes I think within the free market movement, we focus so much on not just data, but just on the market handling all the issues, which is a good thing, but we forget about the community. And I would say within a conservative philosophy, there is the importance of the community. And so, what unites us as a people? It's a common heritage, it's a common language, culture. Those are all important things that shape community. And so, one issue, for example, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but the issue of trade. You know, my argument, and I know some of my friends in the network would say I'm completely wrong, but I would argue that we've had decades of very bad trade agreements that have resulted in the outsourcing of a lot of manufacturing jobs, and has hurt communities. For example, where I was born and raised, when I go back home to visit my family, there's towns that just don't exist anymore because they've been hollowed out. And some libertarians would say, well, that's just a consequence of creative destruction of the marketplace. But is it really beneficial for a community? And so, for example, my grandparents, my grandpa was able to work, and my grandma stayed home and took care of my mom and her sisters. A lot of families can't do that today because the standard of living is just not what the same. And so when you lose a lot of those good manufacturing jobs, it has a consequence. And so I think that point of community is important because we're more than just a marketplace. We're more than just dollars and cents. And so I think that's why I'm very critical sometimes of free trade, because I look at what has been the consequence of that has been devastating to a lot of communities. And look at what COVID taught us. COVID taught us that we are dependent on oftentimes hostile countries for even necessities, even medicine, and that's not a good thing. And here's another example from history: how I came to kind of disagree with the free trade philosophy was I look at our history, and if you look at from George Washington all the way up until World War II, we're primarily a nation that used the protective tariff to protect our home market, to encourage our own manufacturers to, in a sense, be self-sufficient. And if you look at the Republican Party from Abraham Lincoln all the way up to Herbert Hoover, the tariff was a centerpiece of economic policy. And the reason they supported that was they wanted to protect American industry. They used the campaign slogan, "The full dinner pail," which meant that it meant high wages and a better standard of living for workers, and that all creates a stronger community, I think. And so, community is important, and I think that's part of it's a pillar of conservatism, is we want vibrant communities. And like I said, if you look at some places, even here in Iowa, you can see where manufacturing has left, and it creates a lot of problems. A lot of economic depression, a lot of social problems occur because you have a person that goes from working at a factory making a decent wage, going to work for Walmart. Well, that creates some problems.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the small town, the death of the small town is something, I grew up loving to watch the Andy Griffith Show. I never
Yes, right.
experienced the Andy Griffith Show in real life, though. You go to the small towns here in
Mhm.
Texas, and it's not what you see. They're pretty much empty by and large, with some
Yeah,
exceptions. So it's a real issue. It's a real
it
challenge.
is. And one thing, before I moved to the Des Moines area, I lived in a rural part of Iowa, and the community is different. Um, I would say that when I lived in the rural part of Iowa in a smaller town, I felt more part of a community.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, just within my church and my neighbors. And when I moved up here, it's been in a bigger city. I mean, a lot of people would say Des Moines isn't a big city, but but for Iowa standards, it's sizable. But I don't feel like I have the sense of community as I did in the smaller town that I used to live in, and that and I love my church and I love my neighbors, but it's a lot harder to be a part of a community, I think, in these large urban areas than it was in sort of the small town I was in.
Well, that gives rise to two questions then. So first of all, people that are living in the urban sprawl in the big cities, is there a way to emulate that community that was found in the small towns, or are just big city dwellers doomed? And then on the opposite side, is there a way to encourage, I guess we're talking about that previously, encouraging the growth of the small cities again, but maybe tackle the first
Yeah.
one for me.
Yeah, I think you can try to develop a community in a bigger city. It's a lot more difficult. And so, uh, you have to, for lack of a better word, you have to work a lot harder at it.
Hmm.
At least that was my experience moving to a bigger city.
Hmm.
It took a lot longer to meet people in my church. It took a
Hmm.
lot longer to, I was a member of a Rotary Club, and my Rotary Club uh, in the smaller town was a lot different than the Rotary Club here because it's so big. There's so many people in there, and it's hard to develop those relationships. And I think this is where I think the importance of church and family and just community organizations can help foster that sense of community within kind of a bigger, larger urban area. Yeah, and it just takes, for some reason, I think it just takes more effort because well, people are busy. And for example, when I was looking for a church home, a lot of churches in the Des Moines area, they would run 3 or 4 services. So it's just like you go to one service, and then there would be a floodgate of people leaving, and then the next flood comes in, and so there wasn't a lot of it just was harder to kind of fit in with that. And so I think there's something to be said for kind of preserving that, if you want to call it rural or smaller community. And and I'm a product of that, and I'm probably biased in that because I was born and raised in a rural area, and so and I remember as a kid going to a Target store was a big deal.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Well, take me back to that time. I know this is a difficult question, but a young kid who was awed by going into a Target. But you said it also that you were really fascinated by the Civil War. Do you remember
yeah,
what it was that fascinated you?
I was fascinated. Well, first, when growing up, we lived in the country, and so the closest town was about 30 miles away, and they had a Pinedo, which was I think they're all closed now, but it was similar to a much smaller scale Walmart. And then, but if you wanted to go somewhere else, you had to go to Duluth, which is the biggest city that was closest. And of course, they had the Target store, which was exciting to see that. And they also had a big mall. Now malls are collapsing all over. I mean, even here in Des Moines, there's vacant malls. But one thing that going back to the Civil War, I think it was Abraham Lincoln. It
Hmm.
just, when I was reading that children's biography of Lincoln, it just fascinated me, just of his story and the adversity that he had to go through.
Hmm.
Not only not only growing up, but also during the Civil War, and then just how awful the Civil War was
Hmm.
in terms of the suffering on both sides, North and South. I mean, literally, I think the historian Shelby Foote said that civil wars are, a family civil war is the worst type of war, and it just, the fighting was brutal, and it was such a major part of our history. It really defined us as a
Yeah.
nation too. And so I think all that pulled me in and just developed my interest in it. And there's just, when you look at the Civil War too, just from a personality basis on both sides, there's just a lot of interesting people that were taking part in that event.
Yeah. In college, the Civil War fascinated me too. I spent many a semester studying. History professors were my favorite people to talk to. So I feel like
Yeah, yeah,
this conversation has just been wonderful, John. So thank you. But back in college, the Civil War was fascinating me. I think it's starting to resurface quite a bit now. I've actually been thinking a lot about the Civil War in ancient Israel with David and Solomon and all of the civil wars that cropped up then. I'm not sure exactly what it is that's driving it, but it seems like a very present sort of, maybe it's our fracturing of community that's
yeah,
driving these sort of
yeah.
thoughts.
Well, that's a good point. You reminded me of one thing that kind of unifies people is faith, and that's become more important to me. Is just I and I've seen studies with this where they show that people from diverse backgrounds they can find unity and common ground within a church home,
Hmm.
and I think faith is an important element, and so I think that's one element of my conservative philosophy is I have a strong Christian worldview, and I think that helps develop community as well, and that doesn't mean that there's not going to be problems with that because I mean we're a fallen people. I mean, but I think faith is something that should be encouraged, and it's something that I think can help unify us. And it's I'm very thankful for my church home that I have now. I mean, it's just a blessing.
Same, same. Well, take me back then a little further. I mean, not quite as far back. You are just graduating from college, not finding those history jobs that you were looking for. And then you saw that with the Heritage Foundation. What was it about Heritage that, besides the fact that they had a job that you might be
Yeah,
able to do, but there was probably something about Heritage that drew you to it.
it was. Yeah, they had he has since retired, but they had a historian by the name of Lee Edwards, who was a distinguished fellow at Heritage. And Lee Edwards is probably one of the top historians of the American conservative movement. And he's written biographies on Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley and Ronald Reagan. And so they had what was called the B. Kenneth Simon Center at the Heritage Foundation. And so I became an intern for that department. And I was able to work with Dr. Edwards a little bit. And then I also worked with another scholar there by the name of Dr. Matthew Spalding, who's now with Hillsdale College.
Hmm.
And it was Dr. Spalding that really introduced me to the founding fathers and the importance of the American founding. And so I part of my job was to sort of help both of them with different research projects. And it was also neat because our department was also within the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, which at that time was directed by the former Attorney General under President Reagan, Ed Meese. And Ed Meese was just a really kind individual to visit with, and he always that was another blessing too, just to be able to learn from Mr. Meese as well during some of our meetings. So, but that's what drew me to Heritage was because it wasn't necessarily the policy part of it. It was because they were doing all this great work within political philosophy and talking about the history of the conservative movement, uh, uh, writing about the principles of the American founding, writing about the importance of federalism and electoral college, and that's what drew me. And I thought that would be a great, and it was. It actually that time at Heritage was actually I hate to say it, but it was probably more valuable than a full year of graduate education at university. I mean, I was like a sponge absorbing
Hmm.
all kinds of stuff. It was just a really great experience.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Amazing. That sounds like a wonderful. I love that image of you surrounded by all these great minds there at Heritage. But then you were called back to the States. What was it like working in public policy and teaching? I think teaching in a public university plus working in
yeah.
public policy, that seems like quite a distinct worldview going on at the same
Yes.
time. What was that like?
It was exciting, and it was hard because I had to balance everything, and so I had to balance my writing projects at the think tank that I worked for, and then also teach courses. But it also they also fed each other as well because I mean it even though I would be teaching a seminar on the American Civil War, it sort of got my brain working, and so I could it just made me more creative in looking at public policy problems. And the other thing is that the think tank at that time was very I want to say hands off. And so my boss at that time kind of allowed me to write on what I wanted to write on. And so I did a lot of historical writing. In fact, we had a donor. I had just written a little short article on it was actually on President Warren Harding. And we had a donor that contacted me, and so he commissioned me and funded, and I wrote 4 or 5. It's been a while, but I think it was either 4 or 5 major studies looking at the Harding administration and what we could learn from them. And one of them, I was able to win an award because at that time it was the Great Recession, and so I wrote about how when Harding assumed office, he actually was confronted with a severe economic depression at that time. It's sort of forgotten. It's called the Forgotten Depression of 1920, 1921, but it was a severe contraction, coming out of World War I, and how Harding approached that economic crisis was a lot different than what at that time President Barack Obama handled the Great Recession. And so, that was just another example of saying, here's how we handled something, an economic crisis in the past that worked, and these are principles maybe that we should look at today. One thing I liked about, just it kind of reminded me of Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, because he said, conservatism is just like the Ten Commandments. They don't go out of date. And I think, even though, a lot of people say, well, how could we look at something from the 1920s and apply it to today? Well, we can still apply those principles. I mean, yes, government has changed significantly since the 1920s, but what Harding did, we can still do today. And so, for example, what is our national debt? It's approaching 33 trillion, somewhere around there. I mean, it's just this huge number, and it represents a significant threat, not just for the nation, but for the states, because as we know, a lot of states are dependent on Uncle Sam for federal funds.
Yeah.
What happens when that debt collapses? It's going to impact everything. It's going to impact us at the state level. It's going to impact the national economy. We can look back at Harding and Coolidge as examples of presidents who actually cut spending and created a very robust economy. And, government at that time, the federal government was a lot smaller, but Harding and Coolidge both had to make very difficult decisions, and it was hard decisions using the veto blocking legislation. And so even they had to work extremely hard to cut government spending and make sure the budget was balanced. And I think we can learn from that.
That makes complete sense. Okay. Well, I love the image of you balancing all of these things as you're teaching and writing and working in public policy. But take me from that moment to now, where you're with ITR.
Yeah. So what had happened is the think tank I was working for was started by the same founder that started ITR, and he had started a series of organizations. And so the think tank that I was working for kind of transitioned into what is now ITR Foundation, a C3 organization. And so the college I taught at, unfortunately, because of the pressures, it is now closed. It actually shut down last June, which was too bad. But
Yeah, I'm sorry.
and so I joined the ITR team, and that was a big difference because I'm still doing some teaching, but I'm doing online teaching now. for Regent University in Virginia. But most of my work now is on tax and budget policy. I still do some historical pieces now and then, but it was sort of a whole new ballgame coming on the ITR side because one, the staff was a lot different. And
Mm.
so my boss now has been very encouraging and just the whole team that we have here has just been a blessing because I think we work well together and we're able to kind of work towards a common goal. And so, for example, we're working on income tax reform, and so we're all kind of tackling that problem together. And each of us, I think, brings something special to the organization. And so, we have people who do great communication work, and we have others that are doing more technical analysis. And so it's been a good change.
Mm.
So I've
I'm
really
glad.
been blessed by it, and so I think it's and I have to say that for the network too. And one thing I like about the SPN network is just the willingness of people to help. And I don't want to say names because I'll leave someone out, but when I started working for State Policy Group in 2006, there was a lot of people that have been mentors to me.
Mm.
Uh, and that's been a blessing because as someone who studied history, I didn't really know anything about tax policy or budgets. And so there were people in the movement and other think tanks that were able to come alongside me and help me understand, how the state budget works. What
Mm.
does tax policy look like? And so, and if there's any donors that are watching, I want them to know that when they invest their dollars in not only SPN but also in these state policy networks, they're helping the broader movement. And
Mm.
so it's really encouraging that way because, I can send an email or call, colleagues from other organizations, and everyone's willing to help, and that's really neat. And so you're not on an island, and so and I you know and I you know and I think we try to help as well if people contact us. But that's one thing I like about this community. Is that it's really we're all sort of working towards the same goals.
That's beautiful. There is a community here. We were talking about it, and here we
Yes.
are.
Yeah.
Tell me, is there a story that stands out to you in your time working, maybe especially more recently with ITR, that you've seen a specific impact in your state?
Yeah. I think one has been the income tax because this has been the main issue for Iowans for tax relief, and it's been a key issue of our late founder David Stanley, who founded the organization. And one thing that has really been unique about Iowa is the good things that have been happening. And a lot
Mm.
of people ask us, how are you doing it? And I wish we could take credit for it. But one thing that we have going for us right now is that we have a very good governor in Kim
Mm.
Reynolds. And Governor Reynolds has, put forth tremendous legislation, whether it's cutting the income tax. We also have one of the best school choice laws that have been passed in the nation this past year. We've had Governor Reynolds was rated the best fiscally conservative governor in the nation by the Cato Institute. And so I think we've been able to work with her. And so, for example, we've been able to have a seat at that table, and so we've been able to help in that conversation with reforming Iowa's tax system of reforming state government. So one example is this past legislative session. I think one of the most important bills that came out of the legislature. It's not an exciting bill, but it was a state government reorganization bill. And it is basically the first major effort to reform state government in nearly 40 years in
Wow.
Iowa. And so what happened was the governor made this tremendous effort. It consolidated. Iowa had 37 cabinet level agencies. We now have 16, and it's also making some other reforms of streamlining, making government more efficient. Well, ITR was, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to take credit for that passing, but we were helpful in that. I mean, we had op-eds, we had all kinds of stuff that was aiding in that effort to advance that legislation. And because there's a lot of effort by especially progressive and liberal groups that basically say, well, the governor is trying to gut the state budget and deprive everything of key funding, which isn't true. I mean, we hear the tired argument, which I'm sure other states hear, is that, well, you're not fully funding education. And what I always like to say is that it's only in government that you slow the growth of spending, and some see that as a cut. And so, even though the legislature and the governor have done a tremendous job in Iowa of controlling spending, our budget still has grown. And they're still funding education. They're still funding the priorities of government. It's just not as fast as what some liberals and progressives would like. And then I also like to point out is that, they'll point out that, we're not spending as much, but the Wall Street Journal this week had two important stories. You can look at California and Minnesota, two progressive blue states that have followed a tax and spend agenda. And they keep spending all this money. California is projecting massive budget deficits, and our neighbors, Minnesota to the north, is also projecting a budget deficit. And so I just co-wrote an article with one of my colleagues from the Minnesota think tank comparing Iowa and Minnesota because it's two different states. I mean, Iowa has doing some fundamental pro-growth, conservative policies, not just economically, but also policies defending the family and traditional values. Minnesota had one of the most radical legislative sessions in the nation this year. I mean, not just in terms of they had I think it was an $18 billion budget surplus, and the governor and the legislature there spent that all. And they passed some of the most radical social legislation in the nation. And so Iowa and Minnesota are two contrasting states, and I think Iowa is really succeeding. We're growing, we're becoming more attractive, we're becoming more competitive as a state, and I think it's because we have the leadership of Governor Reynolds, and we have a great legislature that has been able to work together to advance some of these common, what I would say, just common sense policies. And just like education, we had a big battle to get universal school choice, and it took several years to do it. But one thing that happened was that the governor really got involved, and she actually challenged sitting Republicans who had opposed school choice, and a lot of those lost their primaries as a result. And in place, the governor was able to get Republicans elected that were supportive of ESAs, and that turned the tide. I mean, and so it was the governor really that, she has really led on these policy fronts, which has made our job a lot easier. Because sometimes you look at our colleagues in like Minnesota or Illinois, and it's very frustrating because those states are such dominated by a progressive philosophy that it's hard to get anything done. And we're very fortunate in Iowa that we have the leadership that we do that is advancing these good public policies.
I'm struck by that contrast that you drew between Iowa and Minnesota, two neighboring states. And you grew up in Minnesota. You were speaking of that rural community that was pervasive when you grew up. How I understand California acting radically differently from Iowa. I understand Texas acting differently from Iowa. But it seems to me that two neighboring states that have a preponderance of rural communities should be so radically different. And you say, well, we have a different governor. We have a strong governor in Reynolds and Iowa, and don't have the same in Minnesota, maybe. But still, Reynolds had to get elected.
Yes, yeah.
What's going on here? And can you help me understand?
Yeah, I would say the big difference is for Minnesota, what is driving the radical agenda is the Twin Cities area.
Okay.
In greater Minnesota, you find a lot of, and my family is longtime members of what was they call the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota.
Hmm.
Most of my family members have switched to the Republican Party as a result of the radical legislation that has occurred. And so greater Minnesota is not in line with a lot of stuff that's being driven by the Twin Cities. And it's the Twin Cities that is the major population center of Minnesota. And if you look at Iowa, the same thing is here. If you look at like the Des Moines area, Ames, where Iowa State University is, Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is. Those are what the blue areas. That's where the Democrats hold the most power in those urban areas. And the rest of Iowa is very conservative. And so I think the agenda of the DFL and that's stemming from the radicalism of the Minneapolis St. Paul area is sort of driving that, and it keeps those Democrats in power. Because, for example, I know he's controversial, but when I go back home to visit my family, former President Donald Trump is very popular, and a lot of local mayors up in that part of Minnesota endorsed Trump for president in 2016 and in 2020. A lot of it had to do with Trump's trade policies that we kind of talked about earlier, that were seen as controversial. But so I think there is an urban-rural divide, and you can see that in the values. And so, for example, within even in the urban areas of Des Moines and the suburbs and the cities around Des Moines, there's the cultural war is alive and well over what is being taught in schools, and over social policy. In fact, it's a huge debate because our governor has signed legislation that has, that some would say would be very controversial, trying to, I would say, uphold traditional family values. And there's been people that have, I don't know if they have, but they've threatened they were going to leave Iowa as a result of it. We passed a heartbeat bill. And the Minnesota governor basically said, you Iowans come on over back to Minnesota because, Minnesota basically passed abortion on demand, and Iowa's done the opposite. And so I think that's a symptom of that urban versus rural divide of some of these extreme liberal views that are so dominant in the bigger cities. And even we can see that nationally. Look at the coasts. I mean, if you look at the electoral maps, you can see the Democrats are very heavily within the coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast with California. And that's where a lot of the radicalism is coming from.
Do you happen to know?
And just one more point on that, and that's why a lot of local, that's why local government is so important too, because in Iowa, we just in this past November we had local elections, and some of the hottest contested elections were over school board races.
Same here in Texas. Well, I have so many more questions about that, but I just looked at the time right now, and I realized we're running over already. Do you still have a few more minutes?
I do, yeah.
Okay, thank you, John. I would love to keep on talking about that, but we'll have to save that for another time. I'm wondering, can you give me any insight into what the goals are there for the future of your organization?
Yeah, our from a policy standpoint, our goal is one, we would like to see the income tax eliminated. And we think we have a strong possibility of actually achieving that this legislative session. We also have a goal of developing and this might even be a larger goal, but developing a more robust, uh, in a sense, we started a new website called ITR Local, and what it does is it collects the property tax information of all Iowa cities, counties, and school districts, and it also provides the spending information. And so, in a sense, it's a massive educational tool for Iowans to understand property taxes, which is very complicated. But we think that's where the next big fight is on these local issues. And
Mhm.
so that's another big initiative that we're pushing for. And it's not just this website providing information, but our future basically is providing training to citizens who want to be engaged in local government, also running for local government. For example, you have the League of Cities. Well, there's no alternative to the League of Cities. The League of Cities tends to be very liberal. And so we want to make sure eventually that if someone's running for a school board, maybe a county supervisor seat or a city council, that we can provide some education with how does a budget work? How do you handle, what questions do you ask? And so that's sort of the larger long-term look for our local government initiative, because the property tax, the property tax is probably the biggest issue we hear the most from Iowans.
Mm.
And it's the most hated tax because it's, you have to write the check for it, for your
Yeah.
property tax bill. And,
Yeah.
and the income tax will also be a big challenge because if Iowa repeals the income tax, we'll be the first state to do so because, no other state has done that. And
Mm.
it'll be a big endeavor.
All right. I'm
Yeah.
excited to see that happen. But as you're going about accomplishing these goals, it strikes me that what we spoke about earlier, the fact that, at least my impression, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the urban areas are the ones that might be most resistant to these sort of fiscally conservative goals.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you
Uh,
reach out to these urban areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Now the interesting part of that is we are seeing uh, on our property tax front, we are seeing more Democrats and progressives ally with us on that issue. In fact, there's one of the suburbs of Des Moines had a massive project to build it was sort of like an aquatic center and I don't know what you'd call it, aquatic center and type of a recplex type facility. And we had a gentleman contact us opposing that project, and this person would never have supported us. I mean, he worked for a progressive nonprofit, but we were allied on the sense that there needs to be property tax reform because
Hmm.
people are being priced out of their homes.
Hmm.
And this gentleman worked for an organization that was helping low income people, and he was having a hard time, having those folks stay in their homes because the property taxes are so high. And
Yeah.
so I think we're finding common ground on that. Now, and unlike the income tax front, it's going to be a lot harder because there's just two philosophies of government there. And
Mhm.
so, this is just one place where we'll probably have to agree to disagree because, for example, there's a progressive think tank in Iowa called Common Good Iowa. And one of my bosses was just on, we have a public affairs program called Iowa Press. And my boss and the deputy director of this Common Good Iowa were debating tax policy. And basically, most Democrats, most progressives in Iowa think that taxes shouldn't be cut anymore and that we need to spend more money on services. And our response would be that, well, we think Iowans should be able to keep more of their money. And also, just because you throw money at a problem doesn't mean you're going to solve it.
Mhm.
And just like education, if you talk to public school teachers in Iowa, they're not going to say that they're underfunded. They're saying the biggest problem is they need help with discipline in the classroom.
Mhm.
That's what they'll tell you would be the major issue in a
Mhm.
lot of classrooms is discipline, not funding.
Mhm.
And so I think that's it's going to be a lot harder to find common ground with liberals and Democrats because they just have a different view of government than what we do.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's and again, you go back to that comparison of Iowa versus Minnesota. Governor Kim Reynolds has a different philosophy than Governor Tim Walz on what the size and scope of government should be.
Yeah. Well, that brings me back to which we started out talking about, which is finding the philosophical, finding those underpinnings that we might connect with philosophically. And I'm not fishing here at all. I'm hoping you could help me learn. Is there any type of, I didn't grow up in rural areas. I grew up in the city. I grew up inner city. So I'm used to living in these inner city places, and I'm kind of searching myself. Are there philosophical connections that the network has when we're pushing for these very fiscally conservative or libertarian ideals, um, that we can find common ground in the urban areas with?
I think so, and I think it has to be issue by issue. Another example is tax credits. I have one of my good friends in the network, John Mazzina, specializes in sort of looking at economic development deals and tax credits. And a lot of times we see that whether it's the state or local governments, they hand out a lot of incentive packages to big businesses, big corporations. And a lot of times that deprives funding for other projects, maybe public education. And you see some common ground between conservatives and liberals on the issue of tax credits and sort of crony capitalism.
Hmm.
And from our perspective, the tax credits don't necessarily work, and
Hmm.
it's creating crony capitalism, whereas people on the left don't like them either for that same reason. And so there's some common ground with we should reform and make the tax credits more transparent. And then, as my friend John Mazzina would say, we can then fight about how to use those money. And we would say once you get rid of the tax credits, use that to cut tax rates, and that would be a better incentive for businesses. Whereas those on the left would rather spend that money on various programs. But I do think there's you can find some common ground, especially another issue that you're seeing common ground in the urban areas is on school choice.
Hmm.
You're seeing more people come together wanting to understand that it's not controversial to allow the money to follow the student and to
Hmm.
empower parents to provide because the parents are starting to realize that it's providing opportunities, life-changing opportunities. And you see that mostly in urban areas because in rural Iowa you just don't have one, you don't have the population, you just don't have you don't have a lot of private school options. But in urban areas, we're seeing a lot of people benefit from school choice, and it's starting to happen in rural areas as well. But especially here in Des Moines
Hmm.
and in other cities in Iowa, people that normally wouldn't agree can come and find agreement that school choice provides opportunities for kids that probably would not exist that were trapped in a failing public school. And so I think that's one area. That's another area where there can be some common ground. But there's going to be a lot. I mean, the fight over income taxes and government spending is I just don't see any common ground on that
Yeah.
because they're always going to be, from their perspective, we're depriving. Um, they use the rhetoric of, well, if you want to grow your economy, you have to invest in education and this and that and all these programs, and that's just something I don't think is accurate.
Hmm. Well, the two examples that you spoke of as possibly that we might find common ground makes me think actually back to a data point that we found with our State Voices public opinion tracker. That we were just throwing phrases at Aaron Norman runs it, so not we. Aaron was throwing phrases at a group of poll respondents, and she found that both Democrats and Republicans responded positively to the term decentralized power. Actually, Democrats responded more positively to decentralized power. Now, I think I posit that the decentralized power for them is more for corporations, not
Yes.
government. But
Yeah.
still, that idea of more local
Mhm.
control seems to be like a found. Would you call that some sort of philosophical common ground that we have?
Yeah, I think that could be. And so that, going back to that tax credit example, you can find a common ground where, a big corporation is benefiting from basically crony capitalism,
Right?
and both the right and the left say that's not the best use of tax dollars.
Yeah.
And um, and I think, going for education as well. I mean, I think more people are realizing that the public school monopoly is not necessarily a good thing. And so kind of allowing more choice in
Yeah.
education, it can find some common ground there. And the other thing I think is a dilemma on government, and I could be wrong on this, but it just seems to me that, uh, uh, you know, and I'm going to sound like a cold-hearted libertarian, which I'm not, but it just seems that whether it's at the local, state, or national level, our culture has become addicted to government. And
Mm.
uh, and I think this is a problem because people expect a lot from government, but they don't want to pay for it.
Hmm.
And so it creates a problem, and makes it hard to rein in government. And we're
Hmm.
seeing the consequences on that at the national level with
Yeah.
the debt crisis we're having.
Yeah.
And it's also a big issue that's driving property taxes.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that property taxes keep going up is that it's local government spending.
Yeah.
But local governments are responding to their constituents who want, they want the roads, they want they want the bells and whistles, and but they don't want to pay for it either. So that creates a dilemma.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
don't know. I hope that doesn't make me a cold-hearted libertarian, but
John, I would never think of you as
yeah,
cold-hearted. Maybe a libertarian, but never
yeah,
cold-hearted.
yeah. I
So I know I could keep asking you questions for forever, but I know we've kept you longer than promised already. So I'll close with this last question. Can you nominate anyone for us to interview next here on Neighbors in the Network?
I would nominate my good friend Vance Ginn. Vance Ginn, he is the chief economist with the Pelican Institute in Louisiana, and he also
Mhm.
has his own economic consulting firm. And Vance is just very interesting. He's one of my mentors, someone who I value highly as a friend, and someone who's taught me a lot about policy. And I always joke with Vance that he and I agree with everything except probably on the issues of immigration and trade policy. And that's but we both admire Calvin Coolidge. And Vance is just, he's got an interesting story, both personally and professionally. He served as a chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration, and so I think your listeners would enjoy hearing from him.
Well,
Uh,
thank you,
and,
John.
um, uh, and like I said, he's just one of them that has, really been a blessing to me in terms of just being a friend and a mentor.
Well,
So
thank you. Thank you. I'll look forward to chatting with Vance. I really appreciate that. And it
yeah,
was such a pleasure getting to talk with you, though, and getting to know you. And I felt like I was back in my old days getting to chat with my history professors. Of course, it's a different relationship, but I'm grateful
yeah.
for this conversation. So thank you.
I hope I don't offend anybody with especially my position on trade. I know some people in the movement won't like that, but uh, but I would say it's the conservative position.
Well, I'm sure one thing I've noticed about the network is that it seems like we have the freedom to disagree here. I'm
Yes,
new,
yeah,
but that's what I've found,
yeah,
and I'm really grateful for that.
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
Yes. All right, John. Well, shall we continue the conversation at another time?
absolutely. I
All right.
enjoy that.
Thank you very much. All right. And thank you all for joining us here on Neighbors in the Network. Thanks for listening to Neighbors in the Network, an offering from the State Policy Network. We hope that this podcast can serve as a place for empathy, understanding, and human connection. Please let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks again.